My son-in-law looked me dead in the eye at my own dinner table and said, "You are the reason this family is falling apart." I was 67 years old. I had built that house with my own hands, or near enough. I'd poured 41 years into a career as a civil engineer, saved every dollar I didn't need, bought the property outright in 2009 when the market crashed and everyone else was walking away from their mortgages. My wife, Helen, had picked out the kitchen tiles herself. She died in that house, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, 3 years before that dinner. And her son-in-law, the man my daughter had married 8 months after the funeral, while I was still learning how to make coffee for one, was sitting at her table telling me I was the problem. I didn't say anything. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of my pork chop. I chewed it slowly. My daughter Claire was looking at her plate. She didn't defend me. She didn't say a word. And that silence told me everything I needed to know about where things were headed. His name was Troy. He was 34, 10 years younger than Claire, and he'd never held the same job for longer than 18 months. When Claire first brought him home, I'd noticed his handshake, the kind where a man grabs your fingers instead of your palm, like he's not sure he wants to commit. I noticed things like that. Helen always said I was too hard on people. She was probably right. But she wasn't there anymore to balance me out. Troy had moved into my house 6 months after the wedding. Claire had called it temporary. That was 14 months ago. They'd turned the guest room into a home office for his consulting business, which, as far as I could tell, consisted of 3 phone calls a week and a lot of time on YouTube. My grandson Owen, Claire's boy from her first marriage, 9 years old and sharp as a tack, had been bumped to the pull-out couch in the basement. I had said nothing. I kept the peace because Claire was grieving her mother too, even if she didn't show it the same way. I kept the peace because Owen needed stability. I kept the peace because I was 67 and tired, and sometimes tired men make the mistake of calling it wisdom. That dinner was a Tuesday in October. I remember because the leaves on the oak tree out front had just started turning, and I'd been thinking about Helen, who used to collect them in a glass bowl on the mantel. Owen had asked me to pass the rolls. Troy had been talking about a real estate investment opportunity he wanted to discuss with me. The third such opportunity in 2 years, the previous 2 having cost me a combined $42,000 that I'd never gotten back. I had said gently that I wasn't sure the timing was right. That's when he said it. "You're the reason this family's falling apart." Claire kept looking at her plate. Owen looked at me. He had Helen's eyes. He didn't say anything either, but I saw his jaw tighten, and I thought, he's 9 years old, and he already knows something is wrong here. I finished my dinner. I thanked no one in particular. I washed my dish, dried it, put it in the cabinet. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I wasn't angry, that surprised me. I was something quieter than angry. I was decided. The next morning I called my attorney. His name is Howard, and I've known him since we were both in our 30s. He's the kind of lawyer who doesn't get excited about things, which is exactly what I needed. "Tell me where you stand," he said. So I told him. The house was mine, free and clear. Everything in it was mine. The joint checking account I'd opened with Claire after Helen died, so she could help me manage bills, I'd said, because I thought that's what families did, had both our names on it. I'd been depositing my pension and my Social Security into that account every month. Troy, I had recently discovered, had a debit card linked to it. Howard was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. 8 months at least, I said, probably longer. The total, when I'd finally sat down with 3 months of statements, was just over $19,000. Restaurants, a golf membership, 2 weekends at a resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, that I certainly hadn't attended. I'd been so checked out after Helen that I'd stopped looking at the statements closely. That was my fault, and I knew it. "Okay," Howard said. "Here's what we do." He walked me through it methodically. First, open a new account at a different bank, just my name. That same afternoon, transfer everything except a small balance. Enough to not trigger suspicion, not enough to matter. Second, have him draft a formal notice of tenancy termination, giving Claire and Troy 60 days to vacate as required under Ohio law. Third, document everything. I asked about the 19,000. That's recoverable, Howard said, but let's get your house back first. I drove to a First Federal branch on the west side of town, not the one Claire and I normally used, and opened a new checking account. The teller was a young woman named something I've already forgotten, and she was very kind and asked me no questions that mattered. I transferred my pension direct deposit. I called Social Security and updated the routing information. I moved everything except $400. Then I drove home and made lunch and watched the news and said nothing. Owen came home from school at 3:15. He dropped his backpack by the door the way he always did, which used to bother me and now didn't. He got himself a glass of milk without asking and sat at the kitchen counter and told me about a project he was doing on the water cycle. "Did you know water is basically immortal?" he said. "I did not know that," I said. "The same water that the dinosaurs drank is probably in your body right now." "That's a terrible thing to tell a man my age," I said. He grinned. "You look so much like Claire used to look before all of this, before Troy." I had been careful not to say anything to Owen about what was coming. He was a child, and none of this was his doing. But I had started, quietly, making arrangements. I had a friend from my engineering days, a man named Stu, now retired, who'd moved to a small house in Brevard, North Carolina, tucked into the mountains. He had a guest room. He told me once, half joking, that I was welcome any time I wanted to disappear. I had called him the previous week. "Not joking," he'd said when I explained the situation. "Come whenever you're ready." The certified letter arrived on a Thursday, delivered by Howard's paralegal. I had made sure I was not home when it came. I'd driven to the library and sat in the periodical section for 2 hours reading about the history of bridge construction, which is the kind of thing I find genuinely interesting and which no one in my household had ever wanted to hear about. Claire called me 6 times. Troy called me twice, which surprised me. He wasn't usually a man who made direct contact when he could get someone else to do it. I let them all go to voicemail. When I got home that evening, Troy was pacing in the living room, and Claire was sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, and the look on her face was not grief or shame or guilt, it was fury. "You can't do this," she said. "The letter explains the process," I said. "You have 60 days. That's more than the law requires." "This is my home." I looked at her. I thought about the kitchen tiles her mother had picked. I thought about Owen sleeping on a pull-out couch in the basement. I thought about $19,000 and a golf membership in Scottsdale. "No," I said, "it isn't." Troy took a step toward me, not threatening exactly, but trying to be. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Probably," I said, "but not for the reasons you think." I went to my room. I locked the door, something I'd started doing 2 weeks earlier, quietly, after I'd noticed the lock on my filing cabinet had been tampered with. The filing cabinet where I kept physical copies of my financial documents, the deed to the house, my will. I sat on the edge of the bed. I thought about what Howard had told me about the debit card charges. Then I thought about Owen's water cycle project. The same water that the dinosaurs drank. I slept better than I had in months. The next 6 weeks were not easy. Claire cycled through anger and tears and cold silence in rotations I came to predict. Troy was surly, and then falsely cheerful, and then surly again. There was a week when they tried the approach of acting as if nothing had happened. Cooking elaborate dinners, leaving them on the counter for me, Troy making comments about working things out like adults. I ate my own food and thanked them for theirs and kept moving. What they didn't know was that I had been busy. Howard had filed the preliminary paperwork to recover the unauthorized withdrawals framed as a claim against the joint account. The joint account itself I'd already let wither. That $400 had drained to zero through a couple of their small purchases, and then there was simply nothing left to take. I had also, quietly, had the utilities transferred entirely to my name at a new billing address. A P.O. box Howard set up, so that any attempt to call and make changes would require a security code only I had. I had also called my financial advisor, a careful woman named Susan who'd been managing my retirement accounts since Helen was alive. I explained the situation in broad terms. She asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I was physically safe. I said yes. The second was whether I wanted to restructure the beneficiary designations on my accounts. I said yes to that too. Owen was still listed. Claire was removed. I felt something when I did that. I won't pretend I didn't. She was my daughter. But the woman sitting across from me in that house, the one who'd let her husband spend $19,000 of my money without a word, who'd stared at her plate while he told me I was the problem. I wasn't sure I recognized her anymore. Or maybe I'd been refusing to see her clearly for a long time. That's a harder thought to sit with. They didn't leave at 60 days. I had expected this. Howard had expected it. On the morning of day 61, I drove to the county courthouse and filed for formal eviction. Howard had the paperwork ready. The clerk was efficient. The whole thing took 40 minutes. Troy had apparently hired an attorney of his own by this point, a man whose website I looked up and who, if his reviews were any indication, mostly handled traffic violations and one DUI case from 2019. He filed a response claiming that Claire had an implied ownership interest in the property based on her substantial contributions to the household. Howard found this amusing in the way that very calm lawyers find things amusing. Her contributions, he said, reading from the document, appear to consist of grocery shopping and one occasion on which she repainted the back bedroom. That's Claire's old room, I said. She painted it without asking me. So noted, Howard said. The hearing was scheduled for mid-January. I spent Thanksgiving alone in the house. Claire and Troy took Owen to her cousins in Columbus, which I hadn't been told about until the day before. I made myself a turkey breast and a small pan of stuffing and watched a football game I didn't particularly care about, and called Stu and Brevard and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. "You doing okay?" Stu said. "I think so," I said. "You sound like a man who's made peace with something." "Maybe," I said. Christmas was worse. Owen came home on Christmas Eve, and we sat together and watched a movie, and I made hot cocoa, and he told me he was sorry things were weird. He was 9 years old. I told him nothing was his fault, and I meant it more completely than I meant anything in a long time. Claire and Troy left on December 26th to spend the rest of the break at her cousin's. They took 3 carloads of belongings. I counted the boxes through the window. I did not help them. The hearing in January lasted less than 2 hours. Troy's attorney made an argument about implied tenancy rights that the judge, a small, serious woman who looked like she had heard every variety of this particular story, dismissed with a patience that suggested she was being kind by not saying what she actually thought. The eviction was granted. They had 30 days. On the way out of the courthouse, Troy told me in a low voice that I was going to be alone for the rest of my life, and that I deserved it. I nodded. "Could be," I said. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected me to flinch. I watched his face rearrange itself around the fact that his words had bounced off me completely, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Something close to free. They were out by February 8th. I know the exact date because I wrote it in the small notebook I'd been keeping. Not for any legal purpose, just for myself. Because Helen had always kept a journal, and I'd started to understand why. February 8th, a Wednesday. The moving truck they'd rented was gone by 2 in the afternoon. I walked through every room in the house. The kitchen tiles were still there, the mantel where Helen's leaf bowl used to sit, the hallway where I'd measured Owen's height in pencil marks on the doorframe. Marks that went back to when he was 4 years old, when Claire's first marriage was ending, and they'd come to stay for a few months, and somehow those months had become his whole childhood in this house. I stood at the doorframe for a long time. Then I got my own pencil and I made a new mark at Owen's current height, the one I'd measured on Christmas Eve when he was in his socks in the kitchen. 4 feet 7 inches. I labeled it with the date. Howard called me the following week. The recovery claim had settled. Troy, apparently, was not eager to have a detailed accounting of the Scottsdale weekends entered into any official record. The settlement was $12,000, which was not the full 19, but was enough. I deposited it into Owen's college savings account. I didn't tell Claire. I didn't tell Troy. I didn't need to. It wasn't about them. In March, I drove down to Brevard for 10 days. Stu had a small house at the edge of a forest. The kind of place where you could sit on the porch in the morning and hear nothing except birds and the occasional truck on the state road half a mile away. We fished. We ate badly and enjoyed it. We talked about our wives the way old men talk about their wives when they finally let themselves. Not with pain exactly, more like reading from a book you've read so many times you know all the good passages by heart. I thought about calling Claire. I thought about it every day. But every time I reached for the phone, I thought about Owen on the pull-out couch and the $19,000 and her face that night, not ashamed, not sorry, just furious. And I put the phone down. She knew where I was if she needed me. She'd always known. Owen called me on a Saturday in April from his dad's house. His biological father had him on weekends now. He said he wanted to know if I was okay. He said some of the kids at school had grandparents who died, and he wanted to make sure I wasn't going to. "I'm not planning on it," I said. "Good," he said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to dress up his feelings in adult language. "Because you're the only grandparent I have left." I had to put the phone down for a moment after that. When I picked it back up, he was telling me about a book he was reading about deep-sea creatures, which he described in more clinical detail than I'd expected from a fourth grader. I listened to all of it. I asked questions. He was delighted that I asked questions. He was delighted that I asked questions. Before he hung up, he said, "Grandpa, do you think fish get lonely?" "I don't know," I said, "but I think they find what they need." He said okay and hung up. I sat on Stu's porch for a while after that, watching the light change on the trees. I thought about the water cycle, the same water the dinosaurs drank. I thought about Helen, who would have known exactly what to say to Claire and probably could have prevented all of this. I thought about the fact that I had stayed in that house long after it stopped being a sanctuary and started being a CG, because I confused loyalty with endurance. I thought about the pencil marks on the door frame. 4 feet, 7 inches. I had a grandson who called me on Saturdays to make sure I wasn't dead. I had a friend who had given me his porch and his bad cooking and 2 weeks of silence when I needed it. I had a house that was mine again, quiet in the way a house gets quiet when it's been emptied of the wrong things. And I had made a decision on the drive back from Brevard that I was going to stop waiting for Claire to become who I needed her to be and start building the years I had left around the people who were already showing up. I wasn't bitter. That might surprise you. I know how this story sounds. But I had been a civil engineer for 41 years, and the first thing they teach you is that you cannot build on a compromised foundation. You don't get angry at the ground for shifting. You assess it honestly, and you build somewhere solid, and you don't look back at the crack in the earth with anything other than the quiet acknowledgement that you finally saw it clearly. The oak tree out front had new leaves by the time I got home, green and small and very determined. I went inside, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the house my wife had chosen and my hands had kept, and I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a question with answers. I keep thinking about the pencil marks on that doorframe. 4 feet, 7 inches. Owen in his socks on Christmas Eve, standing straight because he wanted to be measured accurately the way kids do when they still believe precision matters. That mark is still there. I put it there myself, and I'll be the one to add the next one, and the one after that. That's what I have. That's what's left when you strip everything else away. People ask me sometimes, friends mostly, the few I've told, whether I regret how it all ended with Claire. And I have to be honest, I regret the years before it ended. I regret the dinners I sat through without saying anything. I regret the first time Troy used that debit card, and I didn't look at the statement closely enough to notice. I regret confusing endurance with love, and silence with peace, and staying with loyalty. Those are the things I regret, not the certified letter, not Howard's phone call, not the morning I sat in the periodicals section of the library reading about bridge construction while my daughter received news she'd earned. There's a thing I've come to understand, late in life, that I wish someone had said to me plainly when I was younger. The way you respond to being wronged either restores your dignity or surrenders it. Troy was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right that I'd allowed it. Not out of weakness exactly, but out of a kind of moral laziness that I dressed up as generosity. I told myself I was being a good father. What I was actually doing was avoiding a hard conversation year after year until the bill came due all at once. What finally moved me wasn't anger. Anger would have made me sloppy. What moved me was clarity. The kind that comes when you stop hoping a situation will fix itself and start seeing it exactly as it is. I had a grandson sleeping on a pull-out couch in a basement while his stepfather charged golf trips to my retirement savings. That was the situation. Once I saw it clearly, the path was obvious. You don't negotiate with a compromised foundation. You build somewhere solid. The $12,000 I recovered went into Owen's college account, not because I needed the gesture to feel righteous, but because the money had been taken from a life I'd built through 41 years of showing up, and it belonged, in whatever form I could recover it, to someone who was also learning to show up. He calls me on Saturdays. He asks about fish and dinosaur water and whatever his current obsession is. He is 9 years old and already in possession of more genuine curiosity than most adults I've known. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because someone in his life kept showing up, kept making space, kept measuring his height on the doorframe even when everything else in that house felt like it was being dismantled. I am 67 years old. I don't have unlimited runway, but I've learned, maybe too late and maybe just in time, that the years you have left take the shape you give them. You can spend them waiting for people to become who you need them to be, or you can build something real with the people who are already there. I chose the second thing. The oak tree out front has new leaves every spring. The coffee is good in the morning. The house is quiet in the way it used to be quiet, before it became a siege. I think Helen would understand.